Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Becky Mangini, and I'm the Vice Chancellor for Human Resources and Equal Opportunity and Compliance. And I'm delighted to have you join us today for a special session for School of Medicine supervisors, managers, and HR officers on return to campus planning and COVID-19 workplace accommodation and flexibility training. Before I begin, let me caution that we're all doing this remotely from several counties. In fact, and we're all dealing with the weather associated with the incoming hurricane. In the event we lose power or service, we'll call this off and record it as a webinar. We understand that we want to honor your time, but we also recognize that if we're struggling with power and signal, many of you may be as well. We're optimistic right now, the skies are a little blue, that's not going to be a problem, but I did just want to put that out on the front end. That said, I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk with all of you today. First, to say thanks for all that you have done to help us navigate the pandemic thus far, and for all that you do and that you'll continue to do as we continue the return to campus planning. I think we have a slide deck that someone's going to put up here shortly. And we'll talk our way through the slide deck this morning or this afternoon. And our intention is to go through the deck, and then we'll return to the questions that all of you asked in signing up for today's program. We'll do our best to answer all of the questions that you provided, but we only have about an hour and a half's time. So if we don't get to all of them, we'll make sure that we work to get additional answers out. We will also be recording today's session, and we'll make sure that a recording of the program is available if you want to rewatch the experience, or if you want to make sure your colleagues who couldn't participate today get a chance to participate as well. Today's training is modeled after the training we provided to supervisors and managers across campus several weeks ago, but we recognize there are some specific opportunities and some specific challenges that all of you in the School of Medicine face, particularly as you interact with the healthcare side of things. We know that those things warrant some additional training, and I won't claim to be an expert on all of those things, but I brought in the big guns to help. Harvey Lineberger is here, as is Derek Orr, and we've got a handful of others from both the Central Office of Human Resources, the Academic Personnel Office, and the Equal Opportunity and Compliance Office. Ultimately, we'll do our best to outline what we know, but we also ask you to recognize that this whole experience is a first for all of us, and we're all doing our best to figure it out as we go. A little compassion and understanding goes a long way in matters of human resources and returning to campus and in general. Our goal today is to have you know how and when to engage your teams in return to campus planning. We want to make sure we can provide you with some tools for having those conversations for those who have not yet already, and to give you information about the processes for handling accommodations and flexibilities. We also want to make sure you leave today knowing that you have additional resources and that you're not alone in navigating the return to campus. Next slide, please. Many of you will recall that the Chancellor and the Provost rolled out the roadmap for returning to campus several months ago now. And in that roadmap, there was language really arguing that the best Carolina experience is one that occurs on campus, where all that we do in the teaching and the learning and the research environment can happen collectively and together. They also outlined in that roadmap that in order to have that best Carolina experience in the way that we wanted it to be, it would require that we look out for the safety and well-being of the campus community, and that would be paramount to all other considerations. University leadership recognized that what a return to campus would look like and what a return to instruction would look like would be very different than what we experienced before, but they outlined that they would communicate with students and employees, as well as students and their families, about what the decisions were and how they would be made. Since that time, as many of you know, and some of you have experienced personally, we have in fact phased in fully the research enterprise. The clinical operation never really ended, and in fact has grown over time, often parts of it in tandem with the research enterprise. And we are gearing up for the return of the instructional enterprise. And I know in the School of Medicine, the timing on that is a little different than the timing for the undergraduate and some graduate return, which is scheduled for August 10th. And that instructional timeline for the main campus is really intended to accommodate a return home at the end of the semester by the Thanksgiving holiday. All of this is really a feeder for saying we're working hard to try to bring back the campus, and we're trying to get people back to work on the campus where it makes sense. So I guess maybe before I jump into what the campus will look like, let me jump into, some of you are asking why we're coming back, particularly as numbers in North Carolina are going up. And there are lots of reasons for this. And there's also a very real understanding that the concerns many of you have raised are valid and legitimate. We have, however, continued to work with our public health experts, many of whom hail from the School of Medicine itself, who continue to believe that we can bring the campus back safely. And we can do so safely, particularly if we manage density in a meaningful way and if people follow community standards. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. We have a series of off-ramps built into the roadmap, and many of the communications you all have seen from the Provost's office have outlined what some of those off-ramps look like or could look like. But I think it's also been made clear in the last several weeks, the Board of Governors would ultimately need to sign off were the university to take an off-ramp, particularly as it relates to changes in instruction. We also know that the off-ramps could take many forms, and it doesn't necessarily mean if we opt to take an off-ramp that we will look the way we did last March when the bulk of the campus left campus to work remotely. And again, we recognize that in the clinical operations, that wasn't fully the case, but for others of you who work in the School of Medicine, that was the case. We recognize that we now know a great deal more about the virus, about the means of transmittal, and about precautions we can take. So ultimately, even if the university decides on one form of roadmap of off-ramp or another, we may not end up being in a situation like we were in March, but rather we may maintain the work that's happening in the research enterprise. We may maintain large parts of the clinical enterprise. We may just change portions of the instructional enterprise. It's not an all or nothing deal, and those continue to be conversations of the roadmap team as we move forward. Next slide, please. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, I want to spend a bit of time talking to those of you who are not yet back on campus about what to expect when you do get to campus and what to tell your employees about what to expect when they return. So I want to be clear that some of what I'm going to tell you about is what I know about the main campus and some of the efforts that are being taken largely in office and instructional spaces. For those of you who work in clinical settings in the hospital spaces, I'm going to let Harvey and Derek chime in with any differences. Many of you are already in those spaces, but there are lots of efforts to provide similar service across the entities. So as you've no doubt read, there are community standards outlining expectations for masks, physical distancing, and health monitoring. What that means is that masks will be required for everyone on campus in all public spaces and all public settings. The only exceptions are really closed door offices or when people are dining. And there are also outlines in the community standards setting expectations for a minimum of 6 feet of physical distancing. That is also to be maintained in instructional spaces where possible. And if there are any exceptions to the physical distancing rules, those have to go through the Provost's office. Employees will be expected to do daily health monitoring where they will answer a series of questions. Ultimately, if people feel sick, we don't want you to come to work. If your employees feel sick, we don't want you as supervisors to expect them to come to work. And we certainly want to manage with all of the precautions that we've all read about and maintained. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. We're also putting in play a number of things to keep people safe and keep the physical spaces safe. So housekeeping has done a bang up job in trying to build out their infrastructure and their teams to make sure that we can clean all of the public spaces 4 times a day and provide overnight disinfection. So that when I talk about public spaces, I mean restrooms, entrances, doorways, that sort of thing. And then they will be providing cleaning supplies to units so that folks can individually maintain their private office areas and smaller conference areas that are not used in large public forums. Supervisors will be also asked to work in navigating physical distancing and space configurations as they think about who's returning to work and when, and sort of addressing the workspaces we all live and work in regularly. So for example, if the workspace you typically work in is 10 cubes near one another, without appropriate physical distancing, your supervisor may ask 5 people to come one day or 1 week and 5 people to come one day, or the alternate days or the alternate weeks, to manage the various physical distancing and space configurations of the individual spaces. Likewise, I think we need to be real direct in saying, we are working hard to return people to campus. The governor has said, however, that we are planning to open the state and the universities. The Board of Governors has been clear that we are opening the universities. How we do so safely will require, however, that some people continue to work remotely such that we have the appropriate density on campus. So not everybody needs to come back to campus, and supervisors will be asked to think about a number of factors. We want individual employees to have agency in the decision about when and how to return to campus, but the decision is not the employees alone. In fact, we're asking supervisors to think carefully about what the role and mission of that unit and that role is to the university's mission. And then we're asking them to consider the accommodations or flexibility requests of the individual employees and also the overall business needs. So while we want employees to have agency, it is a discussion that there is a discussion that needs to happen between supervisor and employee such that we can manage the necessary workforce needed to meet our obligations and our mission, while also managing the density and the requirements of ensuring the safety of our community. So the short answer is today's training is not going to be a set of clear-cut, very black and white examples of things that you absolutely know, yes or no, this is how it works. All of this is nuanced. All of it is dealing with people's very real, legitimate concerns, their real, legitimate interest and eagerness to return to campus, and then all of the space and safety considerations that we all need to make about the space we have on campus. So before I hand it over to my colleagues, I want to talk a little bit, sorry, I didn't talk about parking and transportation. Several of you and several of the questions that we got in advance of today's session were asking about parking and transportation. And while I don't have a lot of very direct answers, I can tell you that the Parking and Transportation Office has been working diligently to come up with additional ways to manage what we anticipate will be greater need for parking and changed needs for transit, particularly when we think about Chapel Hill Transit and some of the other public transportation options. We have approved an increase in the number of temporary drivers because some of the shuttle drivers will have smaller numbers of people on the buses. The Chapel Hill Transit is reducing its occupancy, but increasing some of the routes So we'll have more updates on parking and transportation, but I can tell you that is top of mind for folks on this end. And we've been paying very close attention to when people are coming back so that we can figure out the best systems and processes to ensure that everybody can do so safely. We're also looking at options around dining. We know that many of the individual break rooms and shared spaces that exist in many workspaces are not going to be sufficient as we return. And we also know that several folks want to get outside and have a little bit of an opportunity for additional fresh air. So there are a number of considerations being made. There's some additional tenting being added to various parts of campus, including the health sciences space. And then there's also the addition of a number of food trucks, and the timing and rotation of those I'm not entirely clear on, but I know that they are going to be situated around the campus. And those will be in addition to some of the existing food resources, which will largely be takeout only. So before I hand it over to my colleagues to talk about some of the school-specific matters and the accommodations and flexibilities processes, I also think it's important to put some context around what we're all experiencing and what things you all may need to consider as you engage in the conversations with your employees about returning to campus. First, we need to remember that the virus has disproportionately impacted our Black and Brown colleagues. And in North Carolina in particular, it has had a really big impact on the Latinx community. Recognize that our colleagues of color have heightened awareness of and concerns about this disparate impact. Likewise, the murder of George Floyd, the Amy Cooper incident, and the subsequent protests around the country have elevated the conversations around race in our country, and they've also elevated concerns many of our Black colleagues have been vocalizing on our own campus for years. Knowing that the intersection of the virus and the prospect of returning to campus at this time is generating lots of anxiety among some of your colleagues will be important for you to consider as you think about those very real feelings in engaging these conversations. Certainly, we're also cognizant of the fact that the K-12 education system in North Carolina provides important context for these discussions. Schools in the 5-county area that most directly feed into our workforce are planning either fully remote or hybrid instruction in the fall, which will no doubt have an impact on employee availability. We encourage you to work with your employees as you're able to accommodate these varied schedules. Finally, we know that the political environment is heated right now, and that for whatever reason, public health has been pitted against the economy in ways we've not seen before. The university's community standards are not intended to be a political statement or to limit anyone's individual beliefs. They are, however, expectations of employment and will be addressed accordingly. These things are intended to provide a little bit of context to you as you engage in these conversations, but they are by no means an exhaustive list. I just wanted to set a little context out there for you to think about as you listen to the discussion today about flexibilities and accommodations and then engaging in these discussions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to the real experts, and I will come back and join you all at the end where I will lead us through a Q&A discussion based on the questions you all provided in advance. Elizabeth?
Thanks, Becky. My name is Elizabeth Hall, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Equal Opportunity and Compliance Office and the university's ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act Coordinator. I'm going to talk to you all first today about the process for requesting accommodations and workplace flexibility as people deal with different challenges posed by COVID-19. But I want to talk first about some of the things that make the School of Medicine unique and that are really the drivers behind us doing this special training. So the first particular thing, of course, is the overlap between the School of Medicine and UNC Health and the significant role those providers and the folks who support them are playing in North Carolina's response to the pandemic. So this overlap, particularly for providers who work at both the School of Medicine and UNC Health, can present some real gray areas in terms of which process to use and which HR unit is on first for various employee needs. We've worked really hard to clarify that, but we do ask for your patience as we navigate that, both, from an employee and from a supervisor perspective. If we have to ask for a little more time, know that that's not to delay, but just we want to get you the right answer. So one of the things that we've tried to do to recognize this special circumstance is set up a different process for School of Medicine, university employees who are credentialed healthcare providers. For those folks, we're going to ask you if you are high risk and you want to be reassigned to a lower risk area, we're going to ask you to use the UNC Health high risk process, which is run through occupational health. I believe all of you have been provided a link to that form online, but if not, we can get that to you. Of course, as university employees, you do still have access to the EOC and the ADA process. You can reach out to us if you're dissatisfied with the reassignment that you receive, if you feel that doesn't accommodate your health needs, or you could, if you wanted to request, say, leave as an accommodation instead of reassignment, you could start with our process. But if what you're needing because of a high risk condition is reassignment to a lower risk area, you'll start with that UNC Health process. For everyone else who works at the School of Medicine, so anyone who's not a credentialed provider, the general approach at the School of Medicine is that if you can work from home, you should continue to do so. I understand that the School of Medicine is targeting an October 1 return to campus date for many people, but that is just a target. That may change in either direction, and I know likely a number of you on this training have already received a return to campus date that is well after October 1st. I do want to say at the outset that if you've already received a return to campus date that's later into the semester, you're teleworking now, you don't need to request flexibility or accommodations to continue to telework. You're all set if the school has already met your needs, but you would still have the option to request schedule changes or other flexibility if, say, you have childcare or elder care needs that either now or that develop as the semester goes on. So on the next slide, I'll talk, sort of lay out the two types of requests that employees may make related to needs around COVID-19 that you as supervisors may be contacted about. The first type of requests are requests for accommodations based on the employee's health. And these are going to be handled by my office, the Equal Opportunity and Compliance Office. We've got a team of folks that are working on these. And these are going to include any requests that are based on the employee's own health condition. So not a family member's condition, but the employee's own health. And I'll talk a little bit more about the universe of those requests on the next slide. For all other sorts of requests, we're calling those general workplace flexibility requests. And these are going to be handled by you all as managers and supervisors. You're going to have the discretion to make decisions about what flexibility you can offer employees. And that can be for reasons like being in a high-risk age group, having some of those childcare needs that may come up, as Becky mentioned, due to school closures, elder care needs. Perhaps you live with a high-risk individual and may request the flexibility to telework or have some other flexibility to minimize the person you live with's risk, and then general concerns. So those are all the sorts of things that folks may request workplace flexibility for that you all, as managers and supervisors, can make decisions about. Again, I want to echo what Becky said about the disproportionate impact on communities of color that this disease has had. And so that may also be a reason that you come across for someone asking for flexibility to telework or to change their schedule, change the hours they're on campus. And we would ask that you treat that with the same compassion and fairness as some of these other factors. So on the next slide, I do want to talk a little bit more in depth about the types of health-based accommodations that you may be contacted about or that you may need to make yourself. The first type is a request for accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So these are accommodations that are provided because someone has a disability that puts them at high risk of COVID-19. Now, I understand that some folks may have some concerns with identifying as having a disability or hadn't thought of themselves as having a disability because it's never caused a problem for them in their working life before now, and that's okay. So not everything that's high risk is going to be considered a disability. Some things that put you at high risk are specifically listed in the ADA as being disabilities, such as cancer, diabetes, HIV, obsessive compulsive disorder. All of those things would be treated as accommodation requests under the ADA. The ADA might also cover some of the other high-risk conditions that the CDC has identified, depending on the severity of that condition. But there is another bucket of health-based accommodations that our office will be dealing with. Those include weight and pregnancy, two of the high-risk factors that the CDC has identified. And then it would include all those other high-risk conditions that may not rise to the level of a disability. So I think one thing I'd like to say here is that if there is some discomfort either on your part or the part of someone you supervise in identifying as having a disability, they don't have to identify as having a disability to go through the EOC process. We're dealing with all health-based needs as it relates to COVID-19. And that's so that folks have a confidential place outside of their someone in their line of supervision where they can disclose health information. So as far as that information, employees will be asked to certify that they have the condition and that they can and will provide medical documentation if requested. But we are not requiring that documentation in most cases. We want to make this process as easy as possible on folks, recognizing that there may be limited access to healthcare providers for a lot of reasons right now. And when we get these requests that are based on an employee's health concern, our goal is going to be to either limit or eliminate possible exposure. And that may be through having them telework. It may take some other form if telework is not an option. And in that case, we'd be looking at ways to limit exposure. So again, for those of you who are or supervise credentialed providers, you'll start with that high-risk process UNC Health has set up. But for everyone else, if you have a health-based need, you can contact our office. We have a website set up for these sorts of accommodations that we'll show in a little bit. So we can go on to the next slide. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to figure out which of your employees are going to be requesting accommodations or flexibility, because that's really going to impact what staff you have available on site and how you make decisions about operations when the time comes for your particular unit to be returning to campus. So the big thing I want to say here is that seeking accommodations or workplace flexibility is always voluntary. It's always up to the individual employee to decide whether they want to disclose that they have a reason for seeking this assistance. And it's really for them to make that risk assessment for themselves of whether they have a concern with returning to campus. So along with that, it's really important that we avoid singling out any one employee or any group of employees because we think that they may fall into a high-risk category, or we think that they shouldn't be working on site. You're going to want to avoid any sort of singling out, targeting particular employees based on what you think or know about their health or their family. What you can do, to the extent that you haven't already, is to send a group communication to everyone that you supervise or everyone in your unit, asking those who anticipate either needing accommodations or flexibility to go ahead and let you know, or to go ahead and engage with the EOC office so that you can have some sense of what staffing limitations and challenges you might be looking at as we make our way back to campus. As Becky said, you as supervisors and managers do have a responsibility to manage the density of your spaces so that you can maintain appropriate distancing and protective measures within the space. So you can designate employees to continue teleworking, as many folks in the School of Medicine have done, to manage those spatial needs. But what you want to avoid is requiring particular employees to work remotely because you think or know that they are high risk or live with someone who's high risk. To make those decisions based on the business needs, who you need there for business reasons, versus anything that you know about an individual employee. So on the next slide, we'll talk about how to initiate the conversation with staff and faculty about their needs. You may have already done this, or you may be looking at doing this closer to September, October. But it's a good idea to email all of the staff that you supervise, remind them of the phased approach the School of Medicine is taking, share with them where your unit fits into that phased return at this point, and make sure they're aware that the university is committed to providing ADA accommodations, is committed to providing health-based accommodations and workplace flexibility, and make sure they know how to go about making those requests. It is important to include in that communication that requesting an accommodation or flexibility is voluntary, so that people don't feel like receiving this email means that they have to go and fill out a form somewhere and disclose information about themselves. But once you communicate that it's voluntary, you can ask folks who anticipate having one of these needs to go ahead and contact the appropriate office, whether that's UNC Health for the high-risk form, EOC, or you as the supervisor. So we'll go on to the next slide. And so for requests for flexibility that are going to be coming to you as the supervisor or manager, there's really three pieces of information that you'll need from your employees. The first, of course, is, do they need workplace flexibility? The second is, what does that flexibility look like for them? For some folks, that may be a request to continue teleworking either full or part-time. But for other folks, it may just be schedule changes. Perhaps they and their partner are trying to balance, doing at-home online school, and they want to shift their hours so that they can supervise their kids while they do that. Maybe there's been changes to the way that they usually get to work that is going to require them to need a schedule shift. So just figure out what exactly they're looking for. And then the general reason for the flexibility. And by this, we're really talking about I'm in a high-risk age group, not I'm 72, or I live with someone who's high risk, not my spouse is HIV positive. These are conversations that you all already have as supervisors, and we want to emphasize that you all have the skills to navigate these conversations. We just don't want you to feel like if there's a high volume of these, or because it's new or different, that you need to be getting a lot of additional information that you may not need. Those sort of general reasons are going to be sufficient. And if you feel like you need to dig in, or if you need to get documentation, that's going to be a time to reach out either to OHR, your departmental HR, or to your ENMR team there at the School of Medicine. So we have made a decision as a university that we're not going to require documentation in most of these cases, requesting flexibility. So if you feel like you need that, do reach out to one of those offices I just mentioned. And if you do receive documentation referencing medical issues of either the employee or their family, once you realize something is medical information, go ahead and close that. Don't take that information in and forward it to your HR consultant to be handled appropriately. So we'll go on to the next slide. We want to, once you receive requests for flexibility from your employees, we want to give you some guiding principles and then also some specific questions you might want to think through in helping you decide what flexibility can be granted and what plan you'll put in place. So of course, it's really important that decisions about flexibility be made without regard to protected status. And I've listed all of the protected statuses there. I do want to say with respect to age that it is okay to grant a request to have some sort of flexibility because someone is in a high-risk age group. That's fine. That's not discriminatory as long as you're avoiding requiring everyone over 65 to keep working from home for their own good. You can't do that. We do want you to strive to be consistent in your decision-making process, but also recognize that being equitable and fair in these decisions may mean that there are different outcomes for different people. And that's okay. As long as you're giving everyone a fair opportunity to engage with you and go through the process, it's fine if the outcomes look a little bit different because they're always going to be specific to the person's job and their specific needs. The other thing that we want to mention is to avoid using this process to address disciplinary or performance concerns. That's sort of a separate thing that of course needs to be addressed, but we don't want this to, we want to make sure employees are getting what they need as it relates to COVID. So we'll go on to the next slide. And this is sort of a decision tree once you get a request. So if you get a request from an employee for flexibility accommodations, just double check, is it based on their health? If so, are they a credentialed provider? Send them to the UNC high risk or the UNC health process. If they're not a credentialed provider, send them to the EOC. If the employee wants to discuss their leave options, refer them to your departmental HR rep or to OHR benefits and leave. Some of the special COVID-19 leave is not available to School of Medicine employees, so it's important that they're talking with their HR reps to get accurate information about that. And then if it's none of those things, then it's a situation that you as a supervisor or manager can handle. And so on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the questions that you and the person that you're working with can talk through or think through to figure out what flexibility might work for them in their particular role. So for faculty, if they're requesting to teach remotely, and again, this may be trickier in the medical school than campus-wide, just the nature of the courses. You'll want to think about, is the course required to be taught in person, either because there's some hands-on component, it's required for licensing, anything like that. Obviously think carefully through that. If it does need to be taught in person, is the faculty member requesting to teach remotely the only person with the expertise to teach that, or, is someone else available? Can you offer portions of it remotely? What impacts are having to space students out in the classroom going to have on the quality of the instruction if it is in person, and does that counsel in favor of moving it online? And then, if you aren't able to make a particular class work online based on a faculty member's request, you can think about sort of alternative options to meet the faculty member's needs. Perhaps they are only assigned, one class to teach in person and can do the rest remotely. Can they be assigned later in the day so that there's fewer people on campus? How can you set up the space so that there's as little contact at closer range as possible? Can Can you provide additional PPE? Can you require students make contact with the faculty member over email or Zoom? Those sorts of things. And I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but hopefully this gets you started. On the next slide, we've got some questions that you can think about for staff. If you're getting requests from staff to work remotely beyond what they've been provided by the school, you think about whether it's feasible to do that work remotely, or is there special equipment on site that's required? Do you have a physical presence requirement to meet the student or customer needs? And if you do normally service students or customers face-to-face, what's the demand for that going to be looking like in the fall, knowing the other changes that we have to campus density? Are there ways that you can swap around responsibilities between other staff that wouldn't negatively impact the other staff? Can you change the location of where the work is performed or the time it's performed to sort of, again, minimize being on campus at those peak density times? And then, of course, if they do need to be on site, you can think about those things that I just mentioned: partial telework, some schedule changes, additional PPE. All of that is stuff to think through. So on the next slide, we want to give you some options for help, because we know we're throwing a lot at you right now at a time when you're already dealing with a lot. So we want to make sure that you know that the EOC, OHR, your department HR reps, your school ENMR reps, Lisa Voss and Derek Hoare, are always available to help you navigate these decisions. But there are a few times that we absolutely ask that you reach out for assistance to one of those offices. One is that if you believe you need to deny a request, we really want you to be reaching out to us before you deny a request outright, because we want to make sure that we're doing everything possible to meet employees' needs. We also want you to reach out if you have multiple requests for flexibility and are starting to get concerned about having adequate staffing if you granted all of them. We realize that there may be some tough choices in terms of who's on campus and who's not, and we're here to help you make those decisions. If the employee raises concerns about any of the things that I sort of highlighted in those guiding principles, protected status, inconsistency, favoritism, go ahead and reach out to us right away. And then if you're not sure if you're allowed to provide what they're requesting, or if you need help putting it into place, go ahead and reach out. We can get you looped to the right person or office. And then really anything else you're unsure about, we're here as a resource. And on the next slide, we just listed out all of those different resources and some contact information for you. As Becky said, this PowerPoint will be available, so this may be a good slide to flag. You can email all your questions to hr@unc.edu. That's going to get you to all of these folks in one fell swoop, and we can get you to the right person. So hopefully that's easy to remember and just an easy thing to do if you do need help. So on the next slide, just a couple points about once you have granted a request for flexibility, you're going to want to communicate the decision in writing and include your departmental HR rep. Include the details of the flexibility that has been decided upon, as well as the duration that flexibility will be in place. We are not, at this point, able to provide permanent telework for employees, or even to provide telework until there is a vaccine. Right now, we're really dealing with the fall semester. So the duration of the flexibility should be some point in the fall semester that makes sense to check in and evaluate sort of campus conditions, how it's going with the person working remotely, what we know about COVID at that point. And on the next slide, again, before you deny a request for flexibility, you're going to want to make sure you consider all of those alternatives that we sort of presented on the slides to see if there's any alternative option, and then consult with either the EOC or OHR before denying a request. Finally, before I turn it over to my colleague, I'm going to just speak briefly on the next slide about avoiding retaliation. So retaliation is prohibited both by federal law and university policy for seeking accommodations under the ADA. The university has also decided to prohibit retaliation for seeking workplace flexibility. We really want employees to feel comfortable asking for what they need and for what's best for them and their families. We may not always be able to provide that, but we want to have the opportunity to engage in the conversation and for employees to feel safe doing that and that they're not going to experience any adverse action. So please be aware of that. And if you feel that you're experiencing retaliation, you can contact the EOC office. So we're going to shift now to talking about talking with your employees about all of this. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Rebecca Gibson, to do the next few slides.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So as we planned this program, we started off thinking it would be a session about talking to your employees, but we quickly realized giving directives and using a one-sided approach lacks empathy for the supervisor, the manager, and the employee. So instead, the session focuses on how to talk with your employees. And the goal here that we hope folks take away is to have a dialogue about returning to campus, so an ongoing conversation in some places. This is the spirit in which we want everyone to approach and engage in these conversations. For some people, you may have a one-time conversation, and for others, it may be a series of conversations. We do recognize, as we've mentioned already today, that the status of life at Carolina due to the global pandemic may continue to change for all of us. Therefore, we do hope that you consider your own needs before these conversations and also stay open to being flexible with your employees as we're unable to predict what may be needed in the next few days, weeks, and months. With this said, the session for you this afternoon is meant to build upon the tools you already have as managers. So please note, in this session, we will be referencing forms of trauma that might impact folks in the workplace. This includes references to the increase in news coverage of violence against Black people and the protests we have seen across the country this summer. We've referenced this a little bit, both in Becky's introduction for us, as well as in Elizabeth's session. Please take care of yourselves today and after the sessions. Know that these topics can be difficult for many reasons. We will include a list of resources for you and for your employees at the end of this presentation, summarizing some of the resources that we've mentioned already in terms of HR and other offices as well. You're also welcome to take a screenshot of that slide as you're watching this webinar this afternoon, but we will be sending out those slides in the recording as well. So as you talk with your employees, know that they may have questions that you can't answer, and that's also okay. It's better to acknowledge not knowing than to try to make up an answer, and your employees will always be grateful for your genuine response and transparency. This next slide gives kind of a global view of preparing for the conversation, having the conversation, and then the follow-up, recognizing that this may be a series of conversations and hopefully that y'all are engaging in an ongoing dialogue for yourselves and for other folks as well. So in this next slide, we're going to focus on preparing for the conversation and preparing to talk with your employees about the return to campus, acknowledging that it must start before that conversation that you're having in real time. So we encourage you to consider what your needs are in order to focus on your employees and the questions they will be asking. What do you need before the conversation to be present and focused on your employees? Do you need to revisit your notes from these presentations or review the recording videos? And what is your goal in talking with your employees so that you can maintain that focus on the individual that you're talking with? Supervisors and managers, we recognize, are also in a difficult position, and we're not exempt from the stress of the current environment. You may have the same or different questions as your employees, and we also want to recognize that that's okay as well. But before the conversation, we encourage you to practice acknowledging that you may not know the answers and to familiarize yourself with the various tools and resources that have been made available online and in these other spaces as well. We encourage you to take a moment to identify what has been difficult for you during life in this pandemic. Have you felt frustrated or angry? Have you had personal health concerns for yourself, your family, or your friends? Or have you struggled in your home environment? And how have the directives related to wearing masks impacted your sense of security and comfort? Other questions could be, how have you balanced your concerns with the growing conversations on systemic racism and violence against Black people and people of color? And how has the current climate compounded other issues and struggles you have already been dealing with before this pandemic and before our current realities? And who can you talk to about your needs before talking to your employees? Recognizing that the resources that we've mentioned and that we'll remind you about in a few slides are also available to you as an individual in addition to the employees that you're working with. Consider these questions for yourself, and that might also be present for your employees' lives. If you feel strongly about the importance of wearing a mask, consider that your employees may feel uncomfortable covering their faces for a long period of time. They may have struggled with prioritizing their own comfort and safety with public health and what is best for others. Perhaps some employees have also had a close family member who tested positive, while others may not have anyone close to them who've lived with the reality of this pandemic. In our next slide, we want to emphasize leading with empathy in these conversations. We do not separate from our personal experiences and identities when we log on for a work day or when we enter the building and come onto campus. We are all in a unique position to humanize the workplace to make room for people to care for themselves. You have the ability to be a proactive and specific about asking how best to support your employees and thinking about the resources and the tools that are at hand for you. As Becky and Elizabeth have also mentioned, although we're all in this together, we may be grieving from losses due to the pandemic. Research shows COVID-19 has had a greater impact on communities of color. We've also seen an incredible increase of news coverage. And while wearing a face covering in public spaces may be difficult for people of color due to perceptions and stereotypes, for men of color in particular, who are disproportionately stereotyped as dangerous, covering their face may increase false beliefs that they are threatening to others, and they may feel the need to compensate for this in predominantly white spaces by being mindful of their body language to appear non-threatening. Consider how this might be present for your employees in the workspace. Asian communities have experienced an increase in hateful language and messaging related to COVID-19. We ask you to consider how this impacts your employees who may worry about this reality as they return to campus and have their presence in the workplace potentially questioned. What support might they need to return to work in an emotionally and physically safe way? We've also heard from people on campus who have previously experienced trauma, such as sexual violence and domestic violence, that the realities of wearing a mask can be triggering and harmful to their sense of security and safety. We share this as additional information to consider that there might be a myriad of reasons that folks are uncomfortable wearing masks. And although for folks who've experienced certain types of trauma, they may not disclose this history to you, approaching your conversation with employees in an open and transparent manner will help to foster a working relationship that is supportive and not combative. Individual experiences of trauma and stress can be intensified by times of crisis, like the reality that we're all living in. You, as managers and supervisors, have a unique opportunity to focus on the individual employee in your conversations to help them prioritize their needs in order to return to campus effectively and successfully. We encourage you to know what options are available to employees and where they can go to learn more and where you can go to get answers to their questions. I'll turn it back to Elizabeth for preparing for the conversation.
Thanks, Rebecca. So the final or another step in preparing for the conversation is to get clear on the type of conversation that you're going to be having and what the goal is. As supervisors and managers, you may be having some conversations that are negotiations. Those may be conversations about workplace flexibility and how you navigate an employee's needs. Other conversations you may have may be directive conversations, and those may be situations where you are directing an employee to return to campus or directing an employee to comply with the community standards that we have set out on campus, including the mask requirement. So I think recognizing what the goal of the conversation is and the tone beforehand can help you get yourself ready to set the right tone and take the right approach depending on the nature of the conversation. And part of that is being prepared for questions that may come up depending on the type of conversation it is. A question that we're hearing a lot from employees is, or a statement, I guess, is, I don't feel safe coming to campus. What precautions are going to be in place? And so that's something you can prepare for by familiarizing yourself with the campus-wide safety plans and the school safety plans, but also what's happening in your specific unit. How is the space going to be set up in your unit to manage distancing? What protocols do you all have about where people come in and go out and wait? Are you going to be allowing visitors, or is it going to be appointment only? Those are the sort of very local level decisions that you're gonna be in the best position to know and be ready to answer for your employees in these conversations, and hopefully through that provide them some comfort in knowing what they're going to be walking into. Another thing that you may hear is a refusal to come in to campus, or a refusal to follow guidelines, whether that's masks or other distancing requirements. Our goal in all of those requirements is to achieve voluntary compliance. This is a community effort, and we really all do have to work together to keep the community safe. And certainly you want to emphasize that as a reason for voluntarily complying, but there may be situations where you have to take a firmer stance. And I can't tell you right now today what that firm stance is going to look like. I think that's going to depend on the employee and the job that you're talking about, but you can prepare for that by talking in advance with your HR rep, with your ENMR team there at the School of Medicine, and making sure you understand what the school's position is going to be if someone is failing to comply with those directives. You may also hear, why do I have to come in if Becky doesn't? I think that's where really making these decisions based on what is the actual business need to have someone on campus is really important, because if you've done that, you'll be able to say to the employee, we are opening campus. Some jobs must be done on site so that we can serve the campus community. Yours is one of those. We took that into account. And in having other folks not be on campus, we're protecting you and your health by de-densifying campus. So just, those are, I think, the most common questions you're going to be getting going in one of these conversations. So just make sure you're prepared for how you might answer those. So I'm gonna go through the having the conversation piece on the next few slides pretty quickly so that we have plenty of time for your questions. I think a lot of this is stuff that we've covered already, but in having the conversation about, particularly about workplace flexibility, just really try to be as creative and flexible as possible. I think there's probably no solution that is off the table or that can't be explored. These are highly unusual times, so just be as creative as possible in meeting folks' needs. As Rebecca said, really come to all of these conversations from a place of empathy. There's no one in our community who isn't experiencing some sort of impact from all of this. And I think if we can just recognize that as we're talking with folks, that will make these conversations a lot smoother. On the next slide, we did really want to highlight something Rebecca mentioned. It's really okay if you don't know the answer to a question in these conversations. I personally cannot tell you how many times I've had to say, oh, I don't know. I have no idea. When someone has come to me with a COVID-related question over these past few months. So please do be comfortable with that. Know that that's happening for many of us. We're all trying to get through it. And it's okay to just write down the question and say you'll get back to them. And then, reach out to us at hr@unc.edu so that we can get you the answer you're looking for. Finally, as you're having the conversation, we do ask that you have patience both with your employees and with yourself. There are a lot of different things going on for everyone, and you may feel like you're not getting all the information at first or that it's taking a long time, but, just recognize that I think by and large, folks are really trying to do the best they can and just keep themselves and their families safe. and just have patience as you navigate that. On the next slide, as Rebecca said, this may be an ongoing conversation. I don't think that any of us has a crystal ball to know when this is going to end, but we all know it's probably not anytime soon. So there will have to be follow-up and reassessment of plans and flexibility and who is on campus when. So just check in with your employees, set some dates to check in, follow up on how things are going, make sure they have what they need, make sure the work's getting done. Don't be afraid to reevaluate or shift gears if something's not working. And on the next slide, I'm going to take 1 minute out of our Q&A time just to make sure you all have the resources all in one place. Again, for workplace flexibility or questions about anything that we've talked about today, you can contact hr@unc.edu. If you're having difficult conversations that you want to prepare for ahead of time, I think a good place to start is going to be with your excellent E&MR team over at the School of Medicine, Lisa Voss and Derek Hoare. Our report and response coordinators at the EOC are also available. They're very skilled at having conversations with folks who've experienced trauma or difficulty, and that may be something you're dealing with as people have experienced personal impacts, so they're available as well. If you or an employee that you supervise has experienced any of the discrimination or harassment that Rebecca talked about related to the pandemic, you can report that to the EOC. The university has made clear that it's not going to tolerate any sort of harassment because of someone's country of origin as it relates to the pandemic, and so we're here to address those. Finally, you'll see those 3 resources for you as supervisors and managers, because you're all going through this as well. So we want you to take advantage of the support that you need. And I'll just highlight that the Employee Assistance Program does provide some free counseling sessions. I can't remember the number, but it's a handful if you're an employee. And so if that's something that you feel would be helpful to you as we all navigate this, we hope that you'll take advantage. So with that, I want to thank y'all for your time and for all of the patience that you have already shown in working with all of us. And I'm going to turn it back over to Becky so we can answer some of the questions that you have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Rebecca, for all of that helpful insight. I hope you all feel that you have a sense of what the conversations you need to have with your employees are, what they should look like, and some of the resources and tools available to you. Ultimately, that's what we want you to get out of today. We recognize that you all have had some conversations in the School of Medicine with some expectations or hopes that we can be returning people on or before October 1st, or before or on October 1st. Recognize that these conversations, as Elizabeth said there at the end, are ongoing and may need some added back and forth, particularly with some of the more recent events. But we hope that you have a better sense now of sort of what needs to come. I have from you a bunch of questions that I will start going through, and if I'm not the right person to answer them, I will punt them out to the various people on today's panel to help with that. I also want to make sure there's a couple minutes at the end in case Harvey or Derek have anything in particular because they know your audience even better than we do, if they want to add anything, and then we'll make sure we have just a minute or two to wrap up at the end. So I'm going to start with a front end question that says, what is or will the policy be for elderly employees 65 or older returning to campus? And I think Elizabeth did a good job of answering this one in saying that we know that the risk for those goes up for those as they age. And while we cannot tell someone 65 or older not to come to work, if they ask us for flexibility because of their age, it's certainly something we should take into account. Elizabeth, have I accurately stated that? Excellent. All right. several questions in here about masks and mask availability, and employees will get masks as part of a return to work or return to campus employee care package. There will be 2 masks included in that, together with some hand sanitizer and a thermometer. That is not the end of the mask supply, but rather units are each unit on campus has a PPE coordinator, and they are to work with the central distribution to coordinate the delivery of masks and hand sanitizer and that sort of thing. So masks will be provided to those who need them on I believe it's 1 every other day at max basis. Don't quote me on the timeline of that. It should be in the community standards. I should know it by now, but I've read so many things, I'm a little confused. But you will be getting masks. You're also welcome to wear your own mask. And we simply ask that you follow the same safety precautions, launder it, clean it in whatever way is best, depending on the type of mask you use. If you're using a disposable one, that you dispose of it in the appropriate timelines. But you are indeed, at least in the campus setting, and I believe in the non-healthcare settings, allowed to wear your own mask. Is that accurate, Harvey?
That is, and I would encourage anybody who has any questions about that just to check with your local managers and supervisors to make sure that the touch points that you have are covered appropriately given the climate and the environment. So,
excellent, thank you. There are a number of questions about non-lab research faculty who can work from home. And will they be expected to return to campus? I think we've answered that question in that it really is a conversation between supervisors, employees, and department leads, and sort of determining what the needs for having certain people on campus are, depending on the business need. The follow-up to some of these questions was, will there be support available for long-term work from home, such as funds to purchase a desk and that sort of thing. Harvey, I don't know if you want to take the funds to purchase a desk sort of question.
Well, these are local conversations depending on, like, for example, I'm working from my dining room table kind of thing. So these are conversations that you need to have with your managers. And then those managers, if they're PIs, et cetera, need to talk with their department chairs to work out any materials that need to be, maybe that some of your items from your office can be relocated temporarily. There's just lots of solutions that might be brought to bear as opposed to purchasing something new.
Correct. And I will say that there have been pretty strict limitations on procurement of new equipment, in large part because we also are very cognizant of pretty significant budget impacts as a result of the pandemic. And I didn't talk a great deal about that. There are a couple of questions about furloughs and that sort of thing in the questions that were submitted to us. Truth be told, we're really focused right now on trying to bring people back to campus and focused on the mission of reopening. But we're not losing sight of the fact that there are budget impacts, and we're not alone in those. I mean, you'd have to be living under a rock to not know that we're talking about budget impacts in every industry. The reality is there are sort of 3 main factors to the institutional budget. And those are enrollments, auxiliaries, and state appropriations. And those are the things that sort of drive most of the decision-making about institutional budgets. And right now, we don't actually know a great deal about our enrollments. We have a better sense in the School of Medicine, for example, than we do in some other areas. How we provide instruction will determine enrollments at some levels, people deciding whether they're going to be online or if there are enough classes for them to take in person. Those sorts of things impact money that we receive through enrollments. The next major funding source is auxiliaries. And really auxiliaries are everything we do, services we provide above and beyond instruction. So it could be anything from athletics to food service to things like the planetarium. And there's a whole bunch of them, and they provide a lot of various types and flavors of money to the institution. Those are almost always impacted in a situation where there's weather or a pandemic or something like this, where people are not on campus to take advantage of those services. And then the last one is state appropriations. And we, of course, always hope for the best in state appropriations, but we're also cognizant that the state is dealing with its own issues as a result of the pandemic and other decisions. So we have heard early on that the state appropriations for 2021 look pretty reasonable. They are based on some assumptions, and we're going to hope those assumptions stand, but we think we're going to be okay for right now. We anticipate that the state appropriations moving forward could be challenged based on how long this all goes on. What we don't know are what the impacts to auxiliaries or enrollments are yet. So we know there is going to be an impact, and we already know that there are some things that we do on campus that we're just not able to do right now, and we haven't been able to do for months. So we're already seeing some impact. We just don't know how big it will be. What that means for the institutional budget is that we just don't know yet how much of a financial impact we're going to take. We know that 80% of the university's budget is people. And we want to do everything we can to protect the well-being and the jobs of the people we have at the university. We are going to look at options when we have to figure out our financial impact that are both personnel and non-personnel. We're going to look primarily at non-personnel related things first, and then deal with personnel related things if we need to. We are not in a position currently to furlough on a flexible furlough schedule the way many of you remember back in 2008 or 9. That is something that would have to be provided to us for our SHRA employees through legislative authority, not something we have local authority to do. Nor are we having large scale discussions about major budget reductions right now. We're simply initiating discussions knowing that we will have fiscal impacts, but we are not we're going to try to do things a little bit more coordinated as we have an understanding of what that impact is. So the short answer is there's no formal plan for any sort of furlough or large scale reductions in force at this stage in the game. I won't promise that there won't be discussions of those things moving forward, but I will be honest in telling you when and where that happens. We're just not there yet. In terms of what that means for right now, in terms of procurement and hiring, many of you asked questions about the temporary hiring suspension we're in right now. That it has limited our ability to make salary adjustments, new hires, a whole bunch of HR actions. That I expect will continue for some time, and there is a chance it could get tighter. We're doing our best to navigate and request for as much flexibility as we can. We think we are aided when we have to pivot, and we have some tools to be able to do some things a little bit differently. If they make it a full-scale freeze, we lose some of those tools, and we know that it makes it harder for all of you to do your work. So we're advocating for a continued suspension with some exceptions as opposed to a full-scale freeze. But until we have a better sense of our financial well-being, I think it's unlikely that's going to go anywhere quickly. Related then, I'm going all the way back to asking about desks, is the question of, can we buy things for our home? And the large answer is it's unlikely, unless there's a real specific need, as Harvey said. We are encouraging units that can make it available to provide, allow people to move some things, not probably a desk, but perhaps a computer monitor or that sort of thing to their home with appropriate tracking accordingly. And there are some small scale services available to help those who have, for example, insufficient internet resources or we can't change provider access in a region, but we may be able to help with some smaller IT assistance, that sort of thing. But in large part, procurement for setting up a home office is not really going to be part of the institutional plan. Again, we're focused on trying to get you back to the office, so we don't want to get anybody too comfortable at home right now. That said, many of you also asked in your questions about whether or not we're looking at long-term remote work. And that answer is a little bit two-part. The short answer is no, and the longer answer is yes. The short answer is right now, as I said, we're focused on getting people back, recognizing that some people are going to continue to work remotely for a while so we can manage density. And we also know that some jobs and some roles are actually very well suited to work remotely. And we know that that might be a long-term solution. We also know that we can't get too far ahead of ourselves at UNC Chapel Hill, and that we work within a system that has a lot of oversight. And we want to make sure that as we build out long-term remote work plans, we're doing so in tandem with the system and with the Board of Governors, so that we can make sure we're doing it in the way that everybody agrees to on the front end, and we're not putting something in place that we have to change on the back end. So we're working on building out some longer term plans, and we're doing that at the same time we're working to bring people back. And so we'll continue to engage all of you in conversation about that. All right, I'm going to punt a couple of these. So Link, maybe do you want to take the question about, do you anticipate reinstating additional pay for those people declared CDME if there is a need to go back off campus?
Sure, I'm happy to take that. So when we went into the current operational status that we're in, the traditional definition that we've come to expect that's associated with a mandatory employee was adjusted, and that was adjusted at the state level. And the state also made decisions on who could be eligible for that additional premium pay for folks who had to be required to work on site. There was some discretion applied to each of the campuses to be allowed to do that for a good period of time, and unfortunately, we're at a point in time where we could no longer sustain that. So that's not to say that sometime in the future that that might be authorized again if things certainly don't get better, and we hope that they do get better. But as of right now, most of those decisions are being made at the state level. And where there's possibility to allow local discretion for each of the chancellors to make decisions, they're giving it where they can. But we're just not at that point right now.
Excellent, thank you. Elizabeth, I've got one for you. I supervise a person who is immunocompromised. They are unable to work 40 hours a week. What option do they have for reduced work hours? They don't have much leave and have worked at UNC for 11 months.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I think depending on the particulars of the situation, you might explore if they need to do some work on campus, can they do that on a Saturday or Sunday, for example, and work those 2 days on site when hopefully very few other people are on campus, and then do the rest of their work remotely? Can they, work the hours they need to work on site in the mornings or the evenings before anyone else gets there? Is there, obviously at UNC, space is always at a premium, but is there, a really private space that you can provide them? That's a situation where you should have the employee contact the EOC office so that we can be a part of that conversation and help you navigate that. That's one of those health reasons that we can work through. The other thing, with respect to the leave, certainly we could talk. I would encourage them to connect with their benefits office to see if there are any benefits options available. Sounds like they're probably not eligible for FMLA, but we could consider ADA leave as a possible accommodation if that's something they want, so that they have some protective leave for the time they can't work. And then I don't know if, Link, you want to talk about the shared leave bank. That may be another option. But I think for my part, go ahead and have them reach out to our office so that we can engage on those options.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. So one of the provisions that was given to each of the universities was to be able to set up a shared leave bank that operates very similar to voluntary shared leave, although in voluntary shared leave, there's a lot more requirements that would need to be met in order for someone to qualify. The chancellor has authorized that provision locally here at the university. We're in the process of actually fleshing out the process for requesting leave and donating leave. So we hope to have that finalized hopefully within the next week or two, and we'll then be communicating it out. What that will allow an employee to do is if they're in a situation where they have used up all of their own leave balances and still require leave, they could apply to the shared leave bank. Also, other employees could donate their leave to the bank to help out other employees at the university. So stay tuned, more information on that to come, hopefully within the next couple of weeks.
All right, I'm going to throw two questions over to Harvey, and then I am also going to invite Harvey and Derek if they'd like to add just any more content that is School of Medicine specific that we've failed to address thus far. The first question is, we've got a couple of questions about being parents with preschool and elementary school age children and what options there are for either reduced work hours or accommodations related to schooling. And then the other question asks specifically, when are School of Medicine non-clinical, non-research staff required to come back to campus to work? Or is that being left up to the individual departments to manage? So I'll toss it over to Harvey and then let him answer those questions and then chime in on anything else we've missed.
Okay, thank you, Becky. So with regard to the child care issues, that would get into Elizabeth's kind of workplace flexibility and what may be able to be done in terms of breaking up the day and what would be workable given the job requirements. Again, working closely with your supervisors in your area in terms of what potentials might exist. In terms of flexibility, reaching out also, as has been said before, to Derek and Lisa, to also have those conversations if there's some touch points that would be helpful to just consider in those dialogues. But really working with your managers, I think, is the best thing I would suggest. And we are encouraging managers to be as flexible as possible, given the work that is needed to be done. And so balancing all those is what we're trying to do and move forward. Would anybody else add anything to that answer? Okay. With regard to the non-clinical folks and any target, as has been mentioned already, the healthcare system as well as the UNC School of Medicine, other than those that are already slated to come back, we have picked a date of October 1st as just a target. That is not set in stone, as Becky indicated. We are just having that as a kind of objective to consider. Dr. Burks has been very clear that if we have an opportunity to revision work, and we should take that opportunity. So we're trying to work through healthcare as well as the school and continue for jobs that can work remotely to continue to work remotely. That's been kind of our leading point at the moment. But again, those jobs that need to return have returned. The bench jobs that need lab work directly to get accomplished objectives of grants and those kind of things, those positions are already back. But it will be up to the individual managers, guys, faculty members, department chairs to drive those particular points as they are ready. And as the virus continues to evolve, we're keeping in mind social distancing, and it's not like we want to fill a building up every day from 8 to 5 the way it was before. So all of those factors are being balanced and included as they kind of consider returning folks to work. Anybody else add anything to that?
Harvey, as I recall, that date was put in place after we heard a lot of anxiety from employees who needed to make plans, especially work-life plans related to childcare, elder care, situations where both parents were working, and they needed some certainty. And we felt at the time that we could say with some degree of certainty that certain administrative employees did not need to worry about coming back to work any earlier than October 1st. But that is just a target. It is and may very well change.
Correct. Thanks for that addition.
Sure.
And then overall, I would add that at the intersection of the School of Medicine as well as the healthcare system and what building you're in, it may be a university building, it could be a healthcare building. So again, sticking close to your clinic managers, asking those questions, making sure that your lab managers are connected to you and that you are getting communications that are appropriate for your work locations and your work efforts are very critical, because we're trying to align those two organizations with policies as best as possible. It doesn't always work, but we're trying our best to make sure that, for example, the mask policy is pretty much the same if regards to whether you're a School of Medicine employee or a healthcare employee. But touch base with those managers and make sure that you're on point again for the work that you're doing, as you've got the appropriate PPE for yourself. We've also had a lot of questions about people wearing shields and wondering if that's sufficient to not have to wear a mask. And what I understand from our experts is you still must wear a mask, that a shield is an addition to that if you feel like you want some additional coverage. But a shield does not replace a mask in terms of the mask requirement. And then very quickly, I'll just say to Becky and Elizabeth and Rebecca, how much I appreciate you taking the time to present this material for us, specifically designed for the School of Medicine. So I really appreciate you and your team and Link spending your time and helping us in this way. So before we close, I just wanted to acknowledge you and your efforts and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Harvey. I think the thanks is mutual, and I think it's really important to note that we see our colleagues at the School of Medicine as such an important part of the institution and all that we do every day. And we're grateful to have this opportunity. The one thing pandemic has done is given us an opportunity to talk more directly to the employees of the university and to further build on the partnerships that we have been putting in place with our colleagues in HR and the various units. And this is a prime example of that. So my thanks right back to you, Harvey and Derek, and to all of you in the School of Medicine. I'm conscious of the time and we're winding down here. And so as we've stated a couple of times, this is recorded and we will post it both on our page, and we'll make sure that Harvey and Derek have a copy of it so they can post it in a place that's accessible to all of you. We'll make sure if we missed any of the questions that you all asked in submitting your registration for this program, that we get answers to those and we get them back onto your various web pages. And then I also want to just make sure I say thank you to all of you for both making the time to have this conversation today and for engaging with your employees. As we've said, these are crazy, turbulent times. I expect the ride ahead will continue to be turbulent. You all are in a particularly challenging spot because you're also having to navigate both the institutional and the healthcare systems policies. And sometimes that means that the gray area is much clearer than either the black or white on either side. So we appreciate the patience you're providing to all of us. Recognize we're all doing this for the first time as well. So we appreciate your patience and compassion and offer an immense amount of gratitude for all that you do every day on behalf of the university. Thank you again. Know that you have resources if you have questions, and go Heels.